It is around 8 years after Bannockburn, and in northern England, the forces of King Edward II have closed in on their enemy. In early 1322, that man was arguably not Robert Bruce, but his cousin and political foil, the Earl of Lancaster. The battle at Boroughbridge signalled the end of the domestic opposition that has crippled the English response to Scottish domination in northern England. On this day, Lancaster, outnumbered and pinned, is captured and later executed. With his authority reasserted, the English monarch could focus fully on claiming his perceived rights in Scotland. For years, since his failure at Bannockburn, he has had to endure the humiliations of raids and his subjects paying tribute to stave off the Scots under Bruce. With the way clear, Edward seeks a decisive engagement to stamp his authority over Scotland once and for all. Quick word about our sponsor, whose products I actually use, Raycon. I enjoyed using these headphones for a while and decided to gift a new pair to my good friend. With the back-to-school season here, she loves wearing Raycon's bone conduction headphones during school drop-offs or heading out to do errands. They sit just in front of the ear and deliver sound through vibration instead of blocking the ear canal. They're rated IP68 for water and dust resistance, so a spilled juice box or a sudden downpour on a school walk isn't an issue. There's no ear tip, so nothing works loose, and one charge covers about 13 hours, so there's no worry about battery until the weekend. Raycon's quality holds up next to the bigger audio brands at a fraction of the cost, and every pair comes with a 30-day happiness guarantee, so there's no reason not to try these on. The bone conduction headphones are the perfect back-to-school companion. Click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on screen, or go to buyraycon.com/historymarshbc to get 20% off. Thanks to Raycon for supporting the channel. With the English defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce had solidified his hold on the Kingdom of Scots. While he had controlled most of the lands north of Tweed anyway, King Edward II's threatened relief of Stirling could have undermined his authority. However, the Bruce and his countrymen had triumphed and chased Edward off the field and out of Scotland. Yet, if King Robert had hoped this could signal the end of the war, then he hoped in vain. He was fortunate to have taken the Earl of Hereford captive. This rich prize was exchanged for 15 others held in England, including the Bruce's Queen Elizabeth, his daughter Marjorie, his sister Christina, and the indomitable Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow. With his wife back, he could eventually hope to secure his dynasty through a child. Yet almost as important was English recognition of his kingship. Robert spent the next years after Bannockburn trying to force the issue. Raids into northern England became a sad fact of life for the folk north of the Tees. With no effective resistance and Edward's own fortunes darkening to the south, English settlements within the northern counties were forced to pay the invaders blackmail, or the 14th century equivalent of a Dane geld, to preserve their lands and homes. In a move that made strategic good sense, King Robert endorsed a campaign into Ireland under his brother Edward. The energetic and ambitious younger Bruce landed in Ulster in May 1315. However, though certainly disruptive to the English use of Ireland as a source of money and manpower, the dream of a second Bruce kingdom emerging across the Irish Sea to shatter English influence there died with Edward at the Battle of Faughart in October 1318. In July 1315, the elder Bruce laid siege to Carlisle, a place he himself had helped to defend for Edward II's father, the so-called Hammer of the Scots, in 1296. Defending the place with a small garrison was Sir Andrew Harclay. In an impressive show of his military ability, Harclay kept Carlisle, even overseeing the defence against a major two-pronged attack. While the Bruce attacked the eastern walls, the Black Douglas attempted to gain entry from the western side. However, Bruce was ultimately forced to retreat due to weather problems, wider strategic concerns, and his failure to overwhelm the defender, among other things. However, if the failure to take Carlisle frustrated the Scots, then a far greater prize was to be won in April 1318. The great town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, seized in a savage attack by Edward Longshanks in 1296, was retaken by Sir James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray. Berwick had been a thorn in the Bruce claim to Scotland as a great English holdout on the border, and had been Scotland's greatest trading hub before 1296. Bruce had attempted its recapture twice after Bannockburn, but instead of some grand siege or storm, it was treachery that settled the matter in this latest attempt. A certain Peter Spalding, a burgess of the town, offered to betray his section of the town wall to the attackers. Though suspecting a possible trap, King Robert decided to trust the offer, and his men jumped at the chance to seize the town. Sneaking into Berwick during the night, Douglas and his party fought hard to secure the town. Yet, as was normal in those times, the castle was separately held by its garrison and held on until June, after Robert brought an army to bear on the remaining defenders. Lack of supplies that had plagued the town and garrison for months eventually forced the castle's surrender, and the fall of Berwick was another hammer blow to Edward II's aspirations of ruling Scotland. Success supported success. The castles of Wark-on-Tweed, Harbottle and Mitford fell too in the same period. Even for Edward II, such a loss merited a response, and in a rare show of unity, the realm united for a push to retake Berwick in 1319. In the summer, Edward and his hated cousin and rival, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, besieged the town. However, unlike in 1318, no treachery came, and the garrison and people withstood several assaults. The Earl of Moray and the Black Douglas did possess an 8,000-strong army, but chose not to offer battle and instead raided deep into northern England in the time-honoured way. Despite the potential threat to Edward's queen, Isabella, then located within York, the English forces at Berwick did not react initially. However, the Archbishop of York did respond. He mustered an army that contained many clergy, which the Scots roundly defeated at Myton on the 12th of September. This defeat did provoke the desired response. At Berwick, the army was split about whether to continue the siege. Edward and the Southerners were all for continuing to strangle the town and castle into submission, but Lancaster and the Northerners were understandably eager to return to their lands, as it was their possessions and homes being devastated. The fragile unity therefore disintegrated, and with the departure of Lancaster, Edward had to call off the siege. Later in December, a 2-year truce was concluded, but for Edward and the English, this was not the end to hostilities. The Scots went from strength to strength. In 1320, they issued the famous Declaration of Arbroath. For so long as there shall be but 100 of us remain alive, we will never give consent to subject ourselves to the dominion of the English. For it is not glory, it is not riches, neither is it honour, but it is freedom alone that we fight and contend for, which no honest man will lose, but with his life. Soon, with the expiration of the truce, the Scots were about to show just how serious they were about retaining their freedom. However, despite this show of support with the seals affixed to the declaration, King Robert still had internal troubles of his own. The so-called De Soulis plot, a scheme to kill Robert and place either Edward Balliol or Sir William de Soulis on the Scots throne, was uncovered. At the Black Parliament on August 4th, the leading conspirators were tried. Sir William de Soulis himself was imprisoned for life, and other conspirators were executed. Meanwhile, in England, the enmity between the king and some of his leading barons can be partly attributed to favouritism and poor governance. His controversial and infamous friendship with Piers Gaveston was cut short in 1312, when Gaveston was beheaded after a hastily convened court, which included the Earl of Lancaster, condemned him. Edward had been forced to accede to the so-called Ordinances of 1311 that placed limitations on royal favourites, demanded governmental reform, and baronial oversight. Following Bannockburn, his authority was severely damaged, and Lancaster rose to effective power. However, Lancaster too had his own flaws and could not fully dominate, so that moderate lords like the Earl of Pembroke, of the Battle of Loudon Hill fame, tried to bring the sides together. Yet Gaveston's death did not restrain Edward's tendency to elevate favourites, and the rise of the Despensers would bring matters in England to the boil, to the great advantage of the Scots. A father and son duo, the younger Hugh Despenser especially, fanned the flames of dissension by blatantly expanding his power in southern Wales. This to the detriment of powerful men like Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford. This naturally drew such men into the orbit of Lancaster, who hated Edward's favourites on principle regardless, and had a particular disdain for the Despensers. In mid-1321, the so-called Contrariants ultimately forced the exile of the Despensers, removing the immediate threat of civil war, and perhaps giving King Robert and his supporters pause for thought. However, Edward was not entirely without cunning, and later in the year he possibly provoked another crisis when his queen, the future she-wolf of France, Isabella, was refused entry into Leeds Castle, even being shot at in the process. Edward used this excuse to besiege the place, which was held by an absent former supporter turned contrariant, Bartholomew Badlesmere. The siege was a clever way to draw moderates back to him, as he framed it not as defending the Despensers, but as punishing an insult to his queen and royal authority. With the fall of the castle, Edward found the energy to crush the baronial opposition once and for all, something he likely hoped would finally allow a united front, under his personal uninhibited rule, to finally deal with the Scots. The Contrariants were simply too slow to coordinate. Having moved into the Welsh Marches, Edward ultimately forced the surrender of the opposition there at Shrewsbury. Edward next moved north, commanding Sir Andrew Harclay to gather forces in Carlisle to head the rebels off. Lancaster and his allies had moved south from Pontefract and had attempted to hold the royal forces at Burton-on-Trent. However, the royal army forded the Trent elsewhere and flanked Lancaster's army. Lancaster retraced his steps and resolved to make his stand at Pontefract. Other counsel, however, prevailed. The idea was to move north to Dunstanburgh near the Scottish border, and it supposedly took the threat of death via the sword of Sir Roger Clifford to move Lancaster north. Meanwhile, Sir Andrew Harclay, with around 4,000 men, closed in from the north. At Ripon, he was informed that his enemy was close. Looking to block the errant Earl from advancing further north, Harclay marched his army to the town of Boroughbridge and positioned his forces to block both the narrow bridge there and a ford close by. However, while Harclay had the numbers advantage, the Earls of Lancaster and Hereford, commanding the Contrariant force, did possess several hundred knights and men-at-arms. Either mounted or not, these were no joke. They were trained and experienced warriors who were more than able to smash through unarmoured and untrained levies. Harclay, by contrast, also possessed men-at-arms and archers among his ranks. The bridge was narrow and easily defensible. It may also have been too flimsy to take a full-on charge of mounted knights, so that the Earl of Hereford decided to attack it on foot with his division of men. Meanwhile, the Earl of Lancaster could assault the ford nearby on horseback and hoped to force a breakout. Harclay had other plans. Having learnt a lesson or two from the Scots, he ordered his 2 blocking forces into a schiltron-like formation, their lances pointed outwards and ready to receive the charges. This tactic had proved especially deadly against cavalry charges at the Bruce's greatest victory at Bannockburn, and it should also serve to combat Lancaster's assault. Before hostilities commenced, though, Lancaster, perhaps perceiving the odds stacked against him, tried to persuade Harclay to turn on Edward. He offered him substantial lands, a place in his council, and, adding a moral component, decried the influence of the king's evil counsellors, chiefly the Despensers. Harclay would not be moved, however, prompting the Earl to predict that Harclay himself would soon be branded a traitor. With the niceties concluded, Hereford and Lancaster moved their men to engage. Even holding the ford and in tight formation, the Royalists there must have felt a dread anticipation of the approaching knights. At first trotting to position and then galloping into a charge, the Earl of Hereford, along with Roger de Clifford, advanced on the bridge. The volleys from Harclay's archers must have done damage, though the real swift turning point of the affair came when Hereford himself reached the crossing. In a suspicious echo of the more famous Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the unfortunate Earl was slain by a lowly Welsh spearman who had hidden beneath the structure. The man thrust his spear through the planks and into the Earl's unprotected region. Roger de Clifford too was wounded in the fighting, and with Hereford's gruesome demise, the attack here failed. Meanwhile, at the ford, rebel fortunes were no better. Having presented a hedgehog-like wall of deadly lance points to their attackers, it's unlikely Lancaster's horses charged enthusiastically towards this obstacle. At the earlier Battle of Falkirk, there was a similar reaction to the Scotch schiltrons, so that Edward Longshanks had to use his longbowmen to break up these formations before finishing the job with cavalry and infantry charges. Whatever the exact truth of the matter, the archers shot deadly volleys into the advancing enemy, which prevented any crossing. Lancaster withdrew back into the town and agreed a temporary truce on conditions that, on the morrow, he would either fight or surrender. Sir Andrew was nothing but vigilant, however. He kept his men on guard throughout the night, perhaps suspicious of a nocturnal assault. Lancaster's woes only lengthened. Shut up in the town, and with the death of Hereford, many of his knights and followers quietly slipped away, so that by morning no serious resistance could be offered. In contrast, the Sheriff of Yorkshire arrived with reinforcements for the Royalists, effectively sealing Lancaster's fate. Moving into the town, they took him captive. Lancaster, the great opponent of the king, was sent to his own castle at Pontefract and, so it is said, was imprisoned temporarily in the very same tower he had reserved for Edward's incarceration. Just as Lancaster had presided over the execution of Piers Gaveston, so did Edward order his cousin's beheading. With the death of Lancaster and the crushing of internal opposition, Edward could now turn his full attention and wrath towards Scotland. In early January 1322, the Scots began the new year strongly. The Earl of Moray ensconced himself at Darlington, while the Black Douglas and the Steward headed to Hartlepool and Cleveland, as well as Richmond. Used to such raids, the Scots were paid off and after a fortnight made their way back to their own country. During January, Edward had been preoccupied with the domestic opposition. Following this, he was assembling a large army in Newcastle. Numbering 20,000 infantry, 1,500 hobblars and 1,000 men-at-arms, it was comparable to the army faced by the Scots at Bannockburn. King Robert was not idle himself though, and in July he re-entered England. He plundered his way down the west coast, eventually burning both Lancaster and Preston, a penetration of some 80 miles, before he turned back to camp unchallenged for days outside of Carlisle. Re-entering Scotland with livestock, plunder and food, this could only have stiffened Edward's resolve to punish the Scots come his time to march. That time came in early August. Robert, though, was not simply going to allow Edward and his army free range in his own backyard. With his army safely located at Culross, the King of Scots ordered the southeast of his realm to be stripped of anything that could aid the English. Livestock were driven north, crops harvested or destroyed, and even homes dismantled, so that nothing would be left for the invaders. Edward's lumbering army entered Scotland via Melrose, and progress was painful. The English monarch had thought to supply his army via the sea, but contrary winds prevented his navy from obliging. Robert's people had done such a thorough job of stripping the land that the English could only get their hands on one lame cow. Disease, dysentery and famine tormented his ranks, as well as smaller-scale attacks from vengeful Scots. Edward's army reached Leith and sacked Holyrood Abbey, but no attempt was made to pin down the Scots army. The English Goliath had been decisively humbled, and as it retraced its steps, it sacked Melrose Abbey too, though not before the Black Douglas bloodied part of the English army with an attack. On re-entering England, Edward's army largely melted away, so that the English king had to summon new levies to augment the skeleton corps of what only a month before had been an army of 22,500. On October 1st, the Bruce and his army entered England via the Solway Firth, and after a stay of some days near Carlisle, pushed south through the Eden River Valley, stopping at Northallerton on the 13th. In the meantime, Edward had moved from Barnard Castle on the 5th to avoid the Scots, but sent requests for further men as he did so. At Northallerton, Robert's scouts had informed him that Edward was not far away at Rievaulx Abbey, and the Bruce took counsel with his commanders. His army was depleted, and the English king was a very rich target. Though a great victory, Bannockburn may have felt somewhat incomplete with the escape of the hapless Edward. Capturing him at Rievaulx would surely seal the deal on Robert's kingship, and also fetch a literal king's ransom into the bargain. The Bruce and his lieutenants felt the risk more than worth it. Edward, for his part, already knew the Scots were present in the region, and though his army was diminished, it was still more than dangerous enough to both protect his person and give the Scots army a bloody nose or worse. Bruce's army probably numbered anywhere from around 6,000 to 8,000 men, while Edward's forces likely amounted to around 8,000 to 10,000 men. However, pure numbers are deceptive as an indication of relative strength, as the Scots army had its core of experienced commanders and men, individuals like the Black Douglas and the Earl of Moray, as well as many veterans of previous raids, and very likely from the Battle of Bannockburn itself. They were also led by King Robert himself. The English army was made up of both inexperienced levies, but did also have men-at-arms and earls present. Significantly too, it held the heavy advantage of occupying high and difficult ground. The Scots could in theory sweep widely around their enemy's position, but to do so would be to invite withdrawal in good time. Only a narrow passage towards the waiting English vanguard was available if the Scots wanted any chance of claiming Edward as a prize. The Earl of Richmond was in command of the English army. A blocking force, under Sir Thomas Uhtred and Sir Ralph Cobham, held the entrance to the plateau itself and included archers poised to shred the Scots to pieces as they attempted to climb. And so it proved. The Scots, only able to concentrate small numbers against the defenders given the terrain, were hit with volleys of arrows and even stones as they advanced. The fighting was intense, but the experience and intensity of the Scots' push kept the hope viable for a breakthrough, though the English stubbornly held the pass. King Robert had perhaps believed that even the core men of Edward's army, after their recent ordeal in his kingdom, would be demoralised and more easily swept aside. Fighting the Scots, even under the feared Black Douglas though, were reputably two of the bravest knights in all of England. Would such men flee even against this determined onslaught? Knowing an impasse when they saw one, the King of Scots and his lieutenants needed to break the deadlock. While not ideal for armies to scale, it was noted that rugged cliffs off to the side of the pass could probably be scaled by men used to such terrain. Robert therefore ordered his Highlanders to scale these cliffs and take the enemy in the flank. Perhaps simply never considering this approach any danger, the Highlanders scaled the cliffs without challenge from the English. Yet after barely reaching the top, there was scarcely time for the Scots to form and charge to intercept English reinforcements, being led by the Earl of Richmond himself. The sheer shock of the charge must have been total. Taken by surprise, the English knights were scattered, bloodied, and as one source reports, fled like hares before greyhounds. The Earl of Richmond and Henry de Sully, no less a man than the Grand Butler of France itself, were overcome and captured. As for the stubborn English, under Uhtred and Cobham, they were now being assaulted from the front and rear. With the reinforcements gone, and having fought in such a way to merit their reputations, both knights surrendered their swords. Douglas and his men then swept through to join forces with the Highlanders. Largely made up of recent recruits, and now deprived of their commanders, the English main body began to withdraw in disorder. King Edward, recently so confident of his position at the Abbey, must have had a nasty shock at the news that the Scots were almost on top of him. In an echo of his greater defeat at Bannockburn, he fled so rapidly from the scene that many treasures and even his great seal and baggage were left behind. The Bruce would not allow Edward so easy an escape. Pursuing the fugitive monarch, Walter Stewart with 500 horsemen was simply outpaced. Edward reached Bridlington, perhaps hoping for escape by sea, and then from there made it to the safety of York. Here the gates were barred against the Scots, and so they returned to King Robert, who now resided in Rievaulx Abbey. With free reign in northern England, the Scots extracted more ransom from Beverley before they marched back north, re-entering Scotland on November 2nd. Though Edward had escaped his clutches, Robert did receive an earl's ransom for Richmond, though the English commander was held in close confinement for 2 years before he was released for a hefty £20,000. While not as famous a catastrophe as Bannockburn, there is little doubt the battle at Old Byland was a humiliating final check to Edward II's pretensions over Scotland. Having encountered Edward at York after the battle, Sir Andrew Harclay later took matters into his own hands and negotiated a treaty with the Bruce, which was roundly rejected by the king. Lancaster's prediction was then fulfilled, with the victor of Boroughbridge executed at Carlisle for his troubles. Edward would not invade Scotland again, and a truce agreed soon after, though intended to last 13 years, effectively recognised Robert as King of Scots, since Edward agreed to it, with him presented as such. Edward's authority would ultimately collapse, and in 1326 he was deposed by his Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. This proved fortuitous for the Scots. The fragility of the subsequent regime and fear that defeat would bring about its own downfall forced the English into a permanent settlement. With the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, Robert was formally recognised as King of Scots. The freedom of Scotland was now a reality, until new challenges would threaten the House of Bruce. I appreciate you being here for the video. Please give that subscribe button a gentle medieval slap and tickle the like button to appease the almighty algorithm. It will help out the channel greatly. Cheers.